Rules of engagement. Come on, everybody. Albert, you're not allowed to leave the stage under any circumstances. No threatening of any of the participants, especially anyone who puts their hand up to say they asked the question.
No worries.
Otherwise, we need questions to be finished within 3/4 of an hour.
Matches.
Oh, and of course, the berets on the wrong
We're all
person.
hammered. You're going to
So sorry.
All right. We're getting close now. This is a fabulous turnout for the last session of a Sunday compared to any other year. Clearly, you want to hear your questions asked. Okay, so the question time is closed. The ones are in place. I make no apologies for any of the questions. They were voted up or down, so I'm just reading them in the order that they were voted. The first one from Leola, what do you recommend as the first solid food for babies?
Oh, I answered that one already.
Well, go answer it again. There was a different clientele here.
So,
what do we give?
Okay, let me just say, that's not an area of expertise to me. I don't work in, maternal nutrition at all. But having worked with colleagues in California that have written the books on baby-led weaning, and that's their experience and their expertise, they introduce to the children what they're eating at the table. Mm-hmm. So the table, and one of the things I think we've made a mistake with in the United States, we're all from the US, is that we've come up with children's menus. And inevitably they're full of chicken and whatever, right? You don't find children's menus in France and Italy and Germany.
You do find wine on the children's menu.
And they do.
And sippy cups full of it.
Well, we do when we ski in Italy. The little kids come along, they're this big. Their legs are like rubber legs. Have you ever seen kids learn to ski? It's so cute. And then they go into the little ski schools, and you'll be next to them and wait, do those kids all have little tiny little drinks of wine? They do?
No,
am I advocating for wine as the first food? No. But I do think that the normal extension of the table is what we need to introduce to children. But it's not my area of expertise. So I don't know if anybody else has expertise in first food for children. Dale, do you?
Anyone else?
I know.
Anyone breastfed a baby down there that I can see? No.
But let your table guide be. Let the table be an extension. Don't compartmentalize children. The table is a place to meet and greet, and we don't have special cooking for children. They're humans, right?
It's organic.
It's an organic experience. Yes.
All right.
Thank you for whoever threw that one out.
Okay.
No answers.
I know we've been through this before, but now we have 5 experts on stage. Is there a detrimental effect of the microbiome with long-term keto/flex diets? So the microbiome, keep on going keto. What's the downside? There's got to be a downside. Anything that works also has the potential for harm. So who wants to start this? Oh, come on, you've all promoted it.
I don't think there's been any data on long-term effects of the microbiome for a ketogenic diet. I don't think it's been done or looked at.
There's a lot of opinion on it.
There's a lot of opinion on it.
Yeah. And of course, look, these guys living in your guts have a metabolic rate just like anything else. So it's going to change based upon what you're taking in, sugar versus protein and fat and all that. So sometimes it's good to change it, sometimes it's not. I think you have to gauge what the outcome is that you want.
Yeah. All right.
And as Jay said, I don't think we have the data. I haven't seen any. But here are a few things we do know. We do know that the microbiome of patients with Alzheimer's is, on the whole, different than the microbiome of people without Alzheimer's. Right. And how is it different? It's more similar to people with type 2 diabetes and obesity. So there is a difference. We also know that in animal experiments, when you take a microbiome of a healthy animal, they actually do better. You delay the amyloid formation in the animal. So it's a two-way street, just as Brandon's been telling us. It's a two-way street. You do have effects of the microbiome on the Alzheimer's pathophysiology and vice versa. And surprisingly, even just inducing a gene, which you would think a gene that's going to affect the brain when APP mutation would not have an effect on your microbiome, but it does in the animals. So there is this two-way street that we've been hearing about over the last few days. So my guess is, if anything, being on the ketogenic diet and having a less sugar-dependent microbiome, you're going to do better.
Yeah. Well, we know this in the States. I mean, they've studied microbiomes in regions. Even if you move from one state to the other, it changes. Right. It doesn't just change with food. It doesn't just change with mood. It changes with where you're at geographically. And we also know that the ratios of some of these things, like bifidobacter to something else, if it shifts, you are now much more prone for a myriad of diseases. So I think we're probably this far into the microbiome as far as what we really, really understand it and how it relates to everything we've talked about all weekend.
There are plenty of epileptics who've been on this diet for 20 or more years. So there's no data anywhere on what's happened over those 20 years. There seems to be better outcomes. It's like risk-benefit. The benefit is so high for the epileptic that the alternative is worse.
There's a lot of data on fasting and ketosis or ketogenic or paleo methods on mitogenesis and mitochondrial function. Right. So if you go to the traumatic brain injury model or even the neurodegenerative model, you keep the energy producers of your cellular structures. Now, if that translates into the microbiome, of course it does, but we don't always want some things to live by giving them better energy supply. So I don't know if, again, I think the data is probably a wee bit on the short end.
But you can look at, go ahead, slow down.
No, go ahead.
So I think is it the American Gut Project out of the University of Colorado? So they've looked at the different microbiomes across the lifespan and also in different parts of the world. That doesn't answer the question, but it just shows, to your point, that it does change based on also gender.
And Mark, why do you think that there's a negative effect of ketosis on the gut microbiome?
Well, we keep hearing this argument, you need the carbohydrates, so there is a concept, at least for people from certain climates, that foods in season would mean that carbohydrates are available sometimes and not available other times. Winter, you'd go keto, hit at partial starvation. And there's evidence that improves the variety of the microbiome. If you go to protein and fat for a shortish period of time, it ups the biodiversity. I don't know what happens when you make a winter last 25 years. And
well, I think most of us would probably agree that intermittent components of this, or like paleo and stuff like that, keto, we use it in fasting, we use it intermittently. It's not like we're going to put somebody on. Ultimately, we want somebody on a well-balanced diet that's not kind of radical to one side or the other, and they do well. But sometimes you have to kind of maybe lean to one side or the other, and some people do great on a plant-based diet. So,
Amanda, how far can you go into a bit of carbohydrate without ruining it? So the carbohydrates technically are the green leafies, and you can get away with those very, very nicely. But for root vegetables and the like, is a keto diet kind of root vegetable free, or?
So I'm not an expert on keto diet because I look at genes, and genes determine.
Okay, so are there genes to tell us who'll benefit from a
There's
keto diet?
not a keto gene that I'm aware of. No,
Okay.
I haven't seen that one linked.
Denise Furness, we need that added to there.
Actually,
the keto gene.
No, actually, there is a keto gene. It's called MCT1.
That's true.
Which is a monocarboxylate transporter gene. And actually, it's been shown that patients, particularly with Alzheimer's disease, have defects in that gene. So that would support the necessary need for those patients to actually be on a ketone diet.
Yeah.
But we have to define what we mean by that, though, right? Because other genes would suggest the makeup of the fats specific to that approach. And that's what I definitely have seen. Manipulation of the saturated fat, polyunsaturated fat can be really important depending on your genome makeup. That I have seen. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then genes that are, hey, look, you may be a sugar craver, you may be hungry, you may be things that lead to obesity that might make you more prone to want to go keto or something like that because you just can't tolerate other lifestyles very well.
True.
So I don't know that it's one gene. It may be a bunch of genes that lead into a scenario.
That's what I see.
Yeah,
it's a bunch.
And so
I need to say there's got to be a gene that makes people who are doing well on a keto diet go under stress and immediately binge on carbohydrates for 2 weeks. Now, I think it's got or Chinese food in my case, but stress generally leading people to go and break a diet that they would have otherwise been committed to. They all seem to go for carbs.
MSG turns on all those genes.
Does it? MSG?
No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, for me it does. That's the love gene. That's what my parents brought me up
The
on.
FGO gene is definitely one that switches.
Okay. But is there a way of dealing with, they break the paleo and they go carbohydrate, do you just gently bring them back on there, or is that, a killer that some people just will never ever manage? They would rather die than have a paleo diet.
Well, I never bring people back on carbohydrates really quickly.
You don't?
I mean, because, well, it depends. You got to realize something. All of this stuff is dependent on the organism you're dealing with, the human.
Yes.
So some people are type 2 diabetic. You can't do that with them. Or if they're type 1 diabetic and they've changed their insulin now, you got to be careful how you do that. So I think it's very, very dependent on every individual. I mean, again, there's really no just general rule. You do it like this.
It is so individual. It just is.
So we've done the ketogenic diet.
Yeah.
I think we'll get away from
Next.
that one.
Yeah, next,
Okay.
please.
Simple one. Everyone will have an opinion on this. What's the best method of delivery for glutathione when you want to pick up someone's glutathione levels?
Oh, I bet
Who wants
Albert
to
and I
start
will
it
agree.
off?
You go first.
Ladies first.
Oh, I have to start.
Oh, no, she'll go for food. Like, we want
No,
something
I will.
technical
I will
here.
go for the endogenous production of glutathione, which means optimizing upstream methylation cycle, transsulfuration cycle, which and backwards from that, the folate metabolism cycle. Would you agree? Thanks.
So we start with food.
I was not taught by him.
So we start with food, but just at a technical level, in a doctor's surgery, naturopaths, we've got to raise the glutathione.
You have to
How do we
recycle
do
it.
it?
You have to recycle
You have to
it, too.
recycle it, and cordyceps does a great job.
Cordyceps.
And getting it in the system, well, getting it in a vein is great, but now there's different versions of glutathione that are really absorbable. Some of the literature is showing side-by-side comparisons of getting levels that are very, very similar, whether it's intravenous. I mean, you can pack something in intravenously, but orally, like I said, the S-acetylglutathione, the trisomals, all these things, you can put them all and package them together and do very well.
And the liver doesn't consume that, so you don't get a first-pass issue. If you want to get glutathione
You can stick it
to the
rectally.
brain,
If you want to bypass that, go rectally.
thank you.
You'll have a first-pass
Thank you.
effect.
That will stay with me for the rest of the
if you want
day.
to ask me that, I'm usually going to go to the rectum, okay? So that's the way it goes.
Okay, glutathione and caffeine simultaneously.
mushroom.
Phase 1, phase
I
2.
need
Let's
one.
manage it all through the bum. Excellent.
Could I just add, I think it depends a lot on whether you're saying, I want to get it up quickly or slowly,
Yeah,
right?
that's Right.
I
true.
think that's
Yeah.
a huge issue.
And we're
Because,
talking
of course, the best
glutathione.
way is through food over time, of course. But for the patients that we see who have type 3 Alzheimer's, these people are really toxic. They have massive biotoxin exposures. And I mean, it's no question, hands down, their biggest response is to IV glutathione.
Yeah.
The spouses notice the rest of the day they do great. The next day they're kind of back where they were, but they slowly ratchet up over months.
Yeah.
So for that, now, people claim that S-acetylglutathione, as you said, does just as well, but the response is striking in the people with
striking.
IV glutathione.
Especially like in Parkinson patients, there's
Yeah.
several different types. There's pink, there's Parkin DNA, there's different types. 50% they'll get up and walk right off. 50% it will do nothing. But the IV is much, much better.
Yeah.
But how long do you have to kind of
Well,
repeat the...
that's a good question. I mean, a lot of them will put a port in, like a dialysis
Really?
port.
Okay.
And then they can do it themselves maybe once or twice a week. But then we give them a recycler because you got to realize that when they lose that glutathione, complexes 1 and 2 in that mitochondria break down and they die. That's what perpetuates the whole process. And so we keep it, if it works, we keep a steady state, and then we make it to where, it recycles on a continual basis. So it's really a combination of oral and IV to get it to work the right way, or else you just get sick of being poked.
Yeah, I would wonder. Yeah, I would imagine.
That's
Any
what we've
thoughts, Jeff?
seen. I mean, and that's Parkinson's disease. I mean, and it's different, I think, based upon what neurological condition you're looking at.
Yeah, although Parkinson's and type 3 Alzheimer's are both toxin-related diseases. Obviously, one hitting more mitochondria, but I think the same things sort of occur.
Anything, Jeff?
Well, I think the problem with IV glutathione is that the half-life is extremely short. So you
that's
get
what I was
you get
wondering.
an immediate effect, but the effect is not very long. I just use N-acetylcysteine and lipoic acid.
Okay.
It's a better way of sustaining glutathione levels over
That's what I was
time.
wondering. Yeah.
What kind of doses are we talking about? With the NAC, if you're dealing with Clostridium or you're dealing with the toxin response, are you aiming for very high levels, very high dosage?
Well, I don't personally use NAC for C. difficile.
Okay.
But in psychiatry, where it's actually been shown to be very effective for certain conditions, the doses are around 1,200 to 1,600 milligrams a day. And lipoic acid also has a very short half-life, by the way, so I don't know if there are preparations that have long-acting lipoic acid, but that's usually 300 to 600 milligrams a day.
Okay.
I'm not a huge alpha lipoic acid fan.
You know?
It just has so many drug interactions.
All right.
Well, it's personal. I mean, we have a lot of thyroid patients, and it makes them, when we get them stable, and then we introduce alpha lipoic acid, it fluctuates things quite a bit. whether it be conversion, T4 to T3, or when we're looking at T4 to TSH components or reverse T3 to free T3. It all starts to kind of move around a little bit. Even though it's good for the thyroid, it changes the medication's function, if indeed that is what's being used.
We used to think of it as a cofactor that you'd always give with it, and you're saying be a little cautious of that. Was there not Parkinson's being treated with like 12 grams of N-acetylcysteine, that there were trials being done at extremely high doses that showed some effect?
I think it was
Didn't ever worked out?
Yeah,
no, I think those were CoQ10 studies.
those were CoQ10 at what, 800 milligrams to 1200 milligrams?
Right, and by the way, they were not effective.
Probably not, or
No, they're definitely not
okay,
effective.
never came
And it's
out
dangerous too, because if you do that long enough and then stop, you can go into ectopy, and that can be the end of it if you have a heart condition.
All right. Okay, the next one is. Sorry?
Oh,
He declined.
Yeah,
he just handed it
right,
over.
yes.
So he gets
He
the
was
next
asked
one.
first.
That's right.
Yeah.
What else you got to say? Let's hear it.
No, there's
What
one
would
for
you like
him
to know?
later. We've got a very special one for him.
Sorry?
However, this one's
Wait,
for.
she said she has a question. Sorry.
The question is on the screen.
That's this.
Okay. Well, listen,
questions
if you're dealing with an autism, let's talk about autism for a moment. If you're dealing with an autism population, then transdermal glutathione is typically the route you want to take. It's the most practical. Delivery is there. You get a pretty decent effect overall. Okay. It's smelly. It's no fun. But these kids are not going to be really privy to the oral, rectal, or anything else. You have to catch them once you do it, for the first time. They're not that blind and dumb. Okay, they're going to run. And I also just want to comment on the alpha-lipoic acid. I agree 100% in the sense that you really have to determine what your purpose is for that creature, in which patient you want to use it, because there are a lot of contraindications and a lot of challenges in the medication that you're using. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that's really a very significant commentary. It's got good benefits. There have been some good benefits seen with individuals who have schizophrenia, but at the same time, there are a lot of challenges that are also seen. So for the most part, we don't really use it in what we do, but it does have some good parts. There are some challenging issues as well.
Yeah.
That's transdermal only, or did you?
The transdermal version of the glutathione, but I was commenting on alpha-lipoic acid
Right. Okay.
as well.
There's some transdermals and sprays and stuff. Putting a needle in the kid, I agree, can be a wee bit challenging.
And the rectal response is certainly not going to be happening, is it?
And I make a kid about it, but there is, pretty good rectal glutathione out there for people who have certain conditions. I don't know. It just depends on how you want to do it. Depends on what you're into.
Okay. The next question is for Jay Difficile. What's the recommended strategy for someone affected by Clostridium? In 2
Go see
minutes. In the next 2 minutes, how are we going to treat that person?
Well,
Assuming we've got the diagnosis, right?
assuming you have a definite diagnosis
Yeah.
of C. difficile. So the standard way, if patients have recurrent C. difficile from a very classic pharmacological model, is that there is a new medication. I hate to say medications because this is a natural conference, right? But the medication is specifically a monoclonal antibody that is specific to the RNA toxin itself. So it's a one intravenous dose. That's it. Patients actually, completely are cured of C. difficile with this one dose of the medication in that particular strain of C. difficile. For those that don't want the draconian approach, there's actually a lot of different strategies, because C. difficile is an extremely difficult infection to treat, both conventionally or unconventionally. And the reason for that is that you can treat the infection actively, but if you have spore formation, which is the problem with the infection, is that the reason it is recurrent is because when you give antibiotics to it, the spores form as a resistance to the antibiotic, and those just pop back up as soon as the immune system is, challenged by anything else.
Okay.
It's a very complicated question to answer.
Well, the secondary question to that was a little later to Jay. if a person tests positive for C. diff toxin A and the microbiome mapping test, how concerned should one be and how urgent is treatment?
So
if you've got the
there's three components of C. difficile testing. One is toxin A. What that represents is the aspect of the protease that actually is able to enter from into the cell. So it's not itself toxin. It's called a binary toxin, but it is the way of infecting cells. So it's of less concern than TCDB, which is the toxin itself. Right. And the other biomarker is something called GDH, which is interesting because it stands for glutamate dehydrogenase, which is part of the glutamate recycling process of alpha-ketoglutarate by coincidence. And I may have mentioned this, that one of the first early studies that actually provoked my thinking about ALS was a post-mortem study of ALS patients that identified elevated GDH in spinal cords of patients who had died from ALS. And that, interestingly, set into motion the whole glutamate hypothesis of ALS, but no one actually asked the question, well, why is there elevated GDH in the spinal cord of ALS patients? And to me, this was a clue that C. difficile, which actually makes GDH as part of its enzymatic process, is the reason that these patients have GDH in their motor neurons. Practically speaking, a lot of lab diagnostic tests, LabCorp and Quest, can check for GDH. It's extremely sensitive, but not specific, meaning that if you have an elevation of that, it tells you that person has infection, but doesn't tell you specifically that it's C. difficile. There's also other biomarkers, something called calprotectin, which is elevated in response to C. difficile infection. And all these are useful to let you know there's a problem with the gut microbiome, but really the major problem itself is TCDB. That's the one you have to be worried about because that's what produces cellular toxicity.
Okay. Is there a place for fecal matter transfer or transplantation or poo turd test or results? Do they have any part to play in the C. difficile that you're talking about?
100% they do, but only if a person has lower bowel colonization. Most of the C. difficile that epidemiologically we're seeing right now is upper GI. And those patients do not present with classic C. difficile symptoms. They present with constipation, which is worrisome for two reasons. One is that A, you're not going to be able to identify it, and two, to treat it with FMT is going to be ineffective because FMT is only going to restore the bacterial flora in the lower GI tract.
The gastroenterologists who do the FMT here say that it affects the upper tract as well, the small bowel, that it makes its way back through there and ascends and is effective for small bowel. Because the small bowel has only the one mucin layer, the large bowel two. They regard the large bowel as pretty well protected and the small bowel is what they're treating through the FMT.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you don't agree.
Well, it's not that I don't agree. It's that those studies are very, very, small studies of samples where they say, okay, we've restored not only C. difficile in the lower GI tract but also in the upper GI tract. The reality is that the probiotics we introduce through rectal treatment, probiotics do not climb well. They're not like adventurers. They like the colon,
They get in the vagus nerve. They're the wanderers.
What?
They get to the vagus nerve, so they
wander
wander that way.
They get to the vagus. That's true.
You hang them upside down.
But they're downtown bacteria.
Are they?
C. difficile. They are.
Can I use that later?
Sure, of
Is
course.
that Browntown or downtown?
Downtown.
Downtown.
Downtown. Okay.
C. diff is a downtown bacteria that's now uptown. And the reason why it went uptown is because it's inhospitable downtown, meaning that when a person has diarrhea, that's our normal reaction to flush out C. difficile. So the bacteria's like, hey, I don't want to hang out here. I'm going to climb uptown. Right? There's more glucose up here.
Yeah. Better neighborhood. Hang out with
Better
poets.
neighborhood. We give PPIs, which they love PPIs.
Yeah.
So they are very challenging bacteria to treat, and especially that they're colonizing the upper GI tract has given a lot of people very significant concern. Because not only, I think I was telling somebody in the audience here about ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, many people that have studied this believe that actually ulcerative colitis is a C. difficile infection of the upper GI tract.
Yeah, there's some really interesting literature that shows a cross-reactivity between C. difficile and it creating ASCA and ANCA antibodies, which then creates one of those two conditions.
Right.
So
Right.
it's
Yep.
So what kind of consensus do we have on C. difficile as a player, as say, from what I understand, Jay, even the amyloid being effectively the toxin, effectively the bacterial detritus that makes its way to the brain.
Are you setting me up for this question?
No, I'm asking. I'm asking because the amyloid comes from somewhere, and there's lots of potential sources of it, and all it is bent up proteins.
Right.
So is it coming potentially from the bowel? Definitely from the bowel. Is there an agreement about what gets to the brain and how it gets there?
So let's start with two components of the question. So what do we think amyloid comes from, right?
Yeah.
So some people believe that amyloid is a endogenous, defective pathway from amyloid precursor protein. The protein, as Dale mentioned, is cleaved abnormally, so you have these amyloid fragments. And that people believe, though, that amyloid precursor protein its function as an antimicrobial peptide, meaning that it was designed to actually protect against microbes. I believe, and there's actually tremendous amounts of data to suggest the opposite, meaning that amyloid is not an antimicrobial peptide. Amyloid is a direct derivative of the spores and the biofilm that's used to protect, not against other bacteria, but against us. Right. Meaning that the amyloid production is produced by Clostridium. Not only Clostridium, by the way. So fungi produce biofilm, and the biofilm. What's interesting about the biofilm has the exact same helical structure as does amyloid. Right. And interesting, because I'm glad that we're here, because you studied under Stanley Prusiner as the prion expert of the world. Biofilm is a prion protein. It's a prion protein.
Is it really?
Yes. Okay. Which means it's self-propagating, and it's also RNA-based. So if the shoe fits, wear it. And it's a very scary conclusion, because if we're saying that Alzheimer's is a disease of amyloid, and tau, whatever the pathological proteins are, but if we're saying that the bacteria causing them producing amyloid, and not only are they producing amyloid, but that amyloid is a prion protein that can self-propagate, meaning that now we have to be really worried, because now not only is there amyloid there, but the amyloid can actually reproduce across the entire neuroaxis, and that may be the reason for amyloid deposition.
And there's some really interesting papers that show correlation between biofilm plaquing in the mouth and in the brain.
Okay.
So
Australia too.
I agree. I think that amyloid is there for a number. Well, we were even thinking the same thing about autoimmune disease. Is autoimmune disease really a disease, or is it a mechanism to protect you from something else?
Yeah.
Exactly right.
My hero touched me. Woo! I'm touching back.
I did not.
There you go.
We got a bromance going on.
I never left my seat.
Yeah.
So, what's your
Okay,
thoughts?
you guys get a room there.
Yeah.
All right. So,
we did already.
We are in a hotel.
We did already.
Okay. So, what Jay brought up, I think, is incredibly, it's a huge issue, because you're really talking about a whole set of proteins and peptides that have a structure in common. When we talk about amyloid, that's originally a tinctorial property, basically.
Right.
You're talking about, you look at, for example, prion protein, which makes amyloid.
Right.
It exists in a more of an alpha helix, which
Right.
is the non-amyloid former, and then a beta sheet. It literally refolds.
Right.
And the thing is, as Jay pointed out, you get the good guy and the bad guy together, you now have two bad guys.
Right.
So it is like a vampire. You get the good one and the bad one, you got two bad ones, and then you got four bad ones, and you got eight bad ones. So you literally can have a PCR mechanism that is protein-based, based on these things. Now, there's no question, when you look at someone with Alzheimer's, the predominant amyloid in there is amyloid beta.
Right.
It's a very specific piece that comes from the human genome. But when you look at what makes it come out of solution, basically, and make these sheets, You can get islet amyloid from your pancreas, present in your brain.
Right.
You can get bacterial amyloid from your gut, present in your brain.
Right.
So this goes back to what Brandon was talking about. There's no question there is this two-way street. You've got alpha-synuclein and things like that.
Right.
You've got this really interesting communication. And as you said, amyloids, it's almost like Game of Thrones. These things are fighting back and forth
Right.
with each other.
That's a
And
good
there's
one.
no question. The amyloid that we make from APP, and it's people talk about it as misfolding, and they talk about it as the wrong pathway. No, these are two pathways. You use one sometimes, you use the other sometimes. And yes, if you've got a mutation in your APP that makes you use the other one more, yeah, you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. But it's there for a purpose. And we argue that these prions are essentially a mechanism for biological signal amplification, no different than what you have when you have blood clotting. You have a system of serine proteases that are self-activating. Anytime you have a biological system that is multi-goal outcome and requires signal amplification, you have anti-homeostasis, which is what a prion protein is. It's an anti-homeostatic mechanism. Now, if you look at the one from the human, the A-beta, it is actually, as you said, it has antimicrobial properties, as does alpha-synuclein, by the way. But it also has metal binding properties,
Right.
as shown by Ashley Bush over the last 25 years. So, in fact, it is an endogenous anti-biofilm, essentially. It is something that can deal with biofilms. But the problem is when you have these oligomers of this stuff, so you've got this thing that can go in different, essentially, oligomeric states. You have polymers, you have oligomers, you have monomers. And the oligomers are the ones that have the greatest negative effect on synapses, but also have the greatest effect on microbes. So, it's like you got a gun, you're going to hit some good guys and you're going to hit some bad guys. You're not getting something from nothing, just as you were saying before. So, yeah, I think the extent to which these bacterial-related amyloids are interacting with our brain-related amyloids is going to be really interesting.
Yeah.
So it's not a competition. It's not one or the other. It is the interaction and the process happening in the brain being maybe triggered.
It may
by
be
an
triggered.
external
That's
antigen.
been the suspicion, and there's not a lot of data yet one way or the other,
Right.
but it probably is triggered. And no, I think you're right. I think there is an ongoing war between you and the various microbes all the time. But of course, you also have the positive microbes. So yeah, I think that the whole amyloid story, it's kind of a piece of the entire ongoing microbiome, what's good for you, what's bad for you. I'm sure we're going to find specific parts of the microbiome that are going to be anti-Alzheimer's. There are already ones that increase NGF formation, for example, some of the bifidobacteria. And I think as we go on, we're going to identify specific ones that are going to be good for BDNF, good for NGF, good for anti-amyloid formation, and on and on. We're just not there yet.
Yeah, let's not forget the fact that amyloidosis is everywhere. I mean, we have amyloid problems in a lot of places. So, and the brain is particularly interesting. Bottom line is whatever makes it, it does create neuronal damage.
All right.
So,
Once it's
however
in the
we
brain.
get there, we got to do something about it.
We're going to move on. That's to be answered next year. That's going to be Alzheimer's part 6 or part 7. Or
Part
it'll
100.
be Clostridium, the Vegas Alzheimer's.
Interesting.
This one's for Amanda.
Wait.
Put your beret back on.
Anyone notice she's a little twitchy on this chair?
Well, you know what? Because I've got little legs. These guys are like 6'8", and I'm like,
I didn't say you couldn't wander the
Barely
audience.
touch the floor.
I can't touch the floor, so I'm like,
All right.
I can't. This is a problem buying couches. Like, so the deep couches, this doesn't.
I am used to some kind of talent in this place, but you and Jay get me worried.
Thank you.
It's the beret. Okay, wait.
Goitrogens in cruciferous vegetables. Is this a cause for concern? Should we worry or should we not?
So, you know what? I'm going to send a paper to your portal that's going to answer
I have a
that.
portal.
You know, I'm just not going there.
You have many portals.
This is something Arena did not tell me. Okay, but if you send that to my portal, what would you tell me?
So it's interesting because this comes up all the time in the nutrition community. And actually, there was one of your researchers here in Australia kind of tried to answer that. And then when we flipped it back to the United States, like, nope, that didn't make us, the methodology of the science didn't work. So the bottom line is, and I, again, forgive me for not being able to quote the paper, but we do not feel, and you guys can disagree, that there is an issue with goitrogens and thyroid disease. The underlying issue is micronutrient insufficiency.
Yeah.
Okay, now you may disagree, but I did post a paper. It was very well researched recently, and I said, look, finally, can we put this to bed? And immediately it comes back, who says they're the voices of the scientific community? So it just keeps going on and on. But when I'm seeing, and I don't know what you're seeing in clinical practice, when I've asked clinicians, they've said, no, we have not seen it in clinical practice. And that's what this paper actually confirmed. I haven't seen it. You may have different experiences.
I'll just say this is a big, big topic that comes up all the time.
All the time.
Do I give iodine to Hashimoto's patients or not?
Well, that's different.
So now,
that's different.
or a goitrogen, and so what we found is that some of these foods and some of these iodine and stuff like that, it was given to people in endemic areas there was no iodine.
Correct.
So everybody got Hashimoto's. So they're like, iodine causes Hashimoto's. But we also found out that people that have terrible thyroids, they have a dysregulated immune system.
Correct.
So by the time you activate it, it's already so dysregulated they had Hashimoto's, but it was just there. It wasn't active. So you can't just say if you got TPO antibodies, no iodine.
Right.
It's a bad idea. And then I think goitrogens is kind of a weak concept. In other words, is it really that bad? Is it really that powerful? I mean, I think if you ate enough food,
it's a lot.
It could be a problem, but I don't think anybody eats one goitrogen that much.
And that's the point of this paper, said you'd have to eat the equivalent of 5 kilos of, to have that kind of a load dose. You have to eat the equivalent of 5 kilos. So one of the issues came up with the amount of juicing, right? Where people really are juicing a tremendous amount of potentially goitrogenic vegetables. But no, I will post that paper because it took care of it. But I think part of this cause of concern are just eat more seaweed. So seaweed, it is probably one of the most nutrient-dense foods on the face of the earth, which is a natural source of iodine and manganese, and
I said that because of the seaweed.
I think you read the question.
I did read RQF, man.
Yeah. You took the bit that I left out.
Or RQTF. Read the.
You notice that Brandon did not use the "oh, and by the way" for that sacrifice of the sacred cow.
You broke me of that.
Yeah,
So,
the sacrifice of the sacred cow of don't eat goitrogens.
Well, there's been literally, people threaten to beat each other up over that iodine question. I mean, I've been in conferences where it gets out of control, so.
I want to be behind you when that happens.
I
want to be behind you and
I want to
and
ask
these guys.
Albert what you think of that question. Well, not think of it, but you like to pick on people, so I'm not picking on you.
He's been the most quiet guy, man.
Walk to
So
the end.
Albert,
Hey!
would you like me to ask your friend? Would you like to pick a friend? I know. Am I going to hear about that one later?
Every resident I've ever had just thanked you.
Right.
You could pick anyone in the audience. No, but because I know you think in terms of nutrient cycling.
Actually, I really agree with what you're both saying. It's a ridiculously huge topic, and the more we explore, the more it's just not that simple. Because one of the things that we talked about earlier is that you move anywhere from, first of all, the range of evaluation. Okay, our norms are not necessarily the best.
Correct.
We have to reevaluate that spectrum of 0.2535, whatever it is, to blah, 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 blah. Okay, and the range, they're saying it needs to really be lower because we're missing a lot of thyroid disorders. Then you get into production. Okay, so then after you've produced, and we thought we had that straight, but once you get to thyroid production, then there's thyroid transport, which people don't talk about too terribly much.
True.
And then in order to transport from the cell membrane into the cytosol, you've got to have what you mentioned, X number of nutrients present. You have to have selenium, you have to have glutathione, you have to have zinc, you have to have blah, 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 blah. So a nutrient deficiency, as you mentioned, can mess all that up. And then you start talking about all the other variations, including the whole deiodination. Fluoride, which can produce a massive disruption in the production of iodide, comes into play. And if you look at fluoride toxicity, for example, symptomatically, it is the same as hypothyroidism.
Yes.
Okay.
That's why we don't
So,
fluoridate
you
our
know,
water.
you open up a big kettle of worms here. And what I say is, you know, you take a look step by step. If you're going to go through that whole process to evaluate thyroid, it is a really, really big condition. And it's one that requires a tremendous amount of insight and patience with regard to a patient to find out exactly where the difficulty is.
Correct. Yeah.
So unfortunately, while we rarely ever say this is a kitchen sink pizza kind of a phenomenon. You have to kind of look at everything and throw everything at it because you don't know where the difficulty lies. I mean, how many people are really checking fluoride, for example? Okay, and then how many toxins are involved that can affect any step in that process, from iodination all the way to transport, all the way to effect. And then there's receptor site activity.
Exactly.
You know, so it's just a really huge question. And
It's simple to just
it's-
say.
Yeah,
Don't.
you know, goitrogens, okay, well, that's the least of your problems.
Yeah, it is.
Right
Is it reasonable to say that if you've got the micronutrients together, if you've got everything else in place, that this is not an issue at that point? And so you work to get the nutrition
I don't
up,
think it
the
is.
trace
I don't,
elements up,
no, I
and
don't.
50% of my patients are thyroid. We don't see that. I see what you're talking about. I mean, it's really become a ridiculous thing in medicine, and I'll just make the statement, to just give some T4 and say, see you in a year. You know, and they're measuring TSH. And this story, this is a 3-day story with 100 different curves and turns. And so to really, truly help a thyroid patient, you have got to really master a lot of systems. And I don't mean to step on anybody's toes or be disrespectful to any family practitioners, but if you're just doing TSH and plain T4, you really need to step your game.
no one here does that. No one here does that.
No, I'm sure nobody
No, but
has
that has,
ever
to be,
done it.
that has to be brought out because it's true.
Yeah.
You got to do a lot more than that. That's why we're missing so much thyroid disease in general.
Or people just feel like, you know what, while they're still on it, you know, meds. So it's not a good thing.
So could the experts here then comment on this one phenomenon which comes up frequently, which is the people who are doing the window eating and the high-fat diets and are actually, you know, doing well, but they tend to, they claim, you know, they tend to have lower thyroids, and this issue is this hypothyroidism or is this thyroid sensitivity?
Well, there's a...
So they don't tend to have hypothyroid symptoms, but they tend, when you measure them, to be on the low side.
Comment,
Right.
yeah.
Well, there's thyroid receptor down and upregulation, and then there's also this. There's another big problem. People don't measure thyroid binding globulins, and they don't look at total and free levels, and a lot of times these total levels feed back and give us TSH numbers that are erroneous.
Yeah.
And then the free numbers are not bioactively available. And then they don't realize that T4 does things like give you stomach acid and absorption of proteins, and T3, if it saturates receptors or downregulates receptors, it makes the whole thing null and void, so TSH means nothing. So the story is, well, like I said, it's a 3-day story, minimum.
Yeah.
Boy.
5.
Look,
But
we've
I will
got-
have that paper posted.
Okay.
Next
yeah,
year's
into
thyroid.
my
Does help.
portal.
It does.
Yeah, I want that. I want that in my
He
portal
wants
by
your
tonight.
thyroid in his portal.
I'm
I've
going to
never heard of
ask.
that.
We're going to need to wrap up. A simple question, maybe simple. Is MCT oil good for an ApoE4 genotype? Medium-chain triglycerides?
ApoE4? No.
So you keep it out.
Well, you know, I mean, different people have different opinions, I'm sure. This is an incredibly common question. And as we were talking about, you want to get the best of both worlds. You want to get the best of the cardiovascular world and the cognitive world, right? So for someone, so what is done, for example, by the ApoE4.info group of 3,500 or so now, is that when you first start, if you're trying to treat mild cognitive decline, for example, you're trying to become insulin sensitive. And initially, to get, especially if you're thin, to get into ketosis, you can use some MCT oil. You don't want to use it for 10 years. You can use it for a month. After that time, you're going to check your ketosis, and you're now going to go back and see what is my LDL particle number. And if it's below 1,200, you're in good shape. And especially if you're concerned, get yourself a calcium scan and check and make sure that you don't have cardiovascular disease. Because again, if you don't get better, you're going to die. You have Alzheimer's, or you're on your way to Alzheimer's disease. So you switch over to more monounsaturates, just as Jay said. You don't want to be on this for a long period of time. You can switch over to more monounsaturates and polyunsaturates, but you want to get yourself the benefits of that ketosis and ultimately of that metabolic flexibility.
And you
so
can
the answer is,
maintain
yeah,
that?
use it at the beginning, but don't
You
use
can
it
maintain
forever.
that without the
a
MCT
gene
oil.
component.
You
at
should
the
ultimately
levels that
be
you
able
were
to
talking
do it
about?
mostly endogenously,
Huge
yes.
gene
Right.
component that will
The gene
change
component of how you would use it.
how you would use it, and how you would manipulate it.
I mean, we all agree that we're not all like using ketosis, but I say all this, but I mean, we're all clinicians, so we use ketosis for conditions. At least I do. And then fasting for conditions. I mean, I found intermittent fasting to be tremendous for things like brain. 3 days of fasting will get rid of the majority of antibodies in your body. You know, 1 day will change type 2 diabetes tremendously. If you look at the literature on fasting, and then we have intermittent fasting schedules for every different condition. And you know, when you do that and you combine that with your proteins and carbohydrates and fats, and then you fluctuate it and not just stay in ketosis forever, I think that's probably not a great idea. But using it therapeutically like a drug or a time frame of exercise is optimal.
Jay, did you have a dissenting view there?
Well, it's not that I have a dissenting view. It's that, at least as far as the data that I've not been up to date on the data, it's changed, but the original people who developed you know, the concept of using medium chain triglycerides for dementia prevention was a guy in Colorado named Henderson. And the studies demonstrated that it was effective to prevent conversion of MCI to Alzheimer's in all patients except ApoE4 variants.
Right.
So, so I guess maybe that answers the question. Is it good for ApoE4 genotypes? At least as far as the data that I'm aware about, that it doesn't show an effect in ApoE4 genotypes. So
As a monotherapy.
As a
As a
monotherapy.
monotherapy.
Yeah,
And
I
there's
think
other
that's been the
genes that can turn
problem
on
Yeah.
that
the
make
entire
that
field.
Yeah,
It's
of
all
course.
about 1, 1, 1, 1,
Yeah.
1. I think
There's
that's
a
the issue.
series
Yeah.
of genes that can turn on that give your odds ratio of that ApoE4 being bad, being really bad.
Right.
Yeah, they're a stack. Yeah.
All right. I think we are done, ladies and gentlemen. The 5 geniuses on the stage.
Fourth was me.
Even if the chairs are a little big, but the moment of the day certainly went to the Wanderer today.
Good stuff, eh?
So I want to thank all of you. It's been fabulous. The question time was really illuminating. There are another 32 questions. I was never going to really get through all of this, but I took the ones you voted
All
up.
about vegetables.
And if you'd all obeyed my instructions,
I
your
knew
questions would have got
sauerkraut
higher
free?
rather than being answered in a podcast later on.
Great kids.
So to each of our speakers, it's been